Hey guys, it's Danny. Today we are talking about stressed orchids and I have some really great personal tips to give you in order to better care for an orchid which might be a little stressed, might be a little bit in shock after a repotting, might have been already a little bit sick when you purchased it because sadly things don't always go smooth with orchids. So if you've ever encountered issues with brand new orchids, particularly after you repotted them, or if you have a rootless orchid right now, this video is for you. Today's episode, along with our entire Orchid Care for Beginners series, is sponsored by repotme.com, who offers you everything you could possibly need to properly take care of your orchid, from media to fertilizer, pots, and all sorts of accessories. Some of the accessories that I will use in this care series and in today's video are provided by RepotMe, so I will link you to their website down below in the description. Feel free to visit them at any time. Having your orchid become rootless, especially after repotting, is not a very uncommon thing. Most of us have gone through it, and this is because orchids, just like any other plant, can go into a little bit of a transplant shock, particularly if they're brand new and they're not adjusted to your environment, or they've already been stressed in the supermarkets or flower shops. Since this is a pretty complex subject, I will direct you to the description where I will share 2 more videos that are related to today's video. One deals with minimizing and avoiding transplant shock, and the other one deals with dehydrated orchids. And those videos really go hand in hand with today's video, which will focus a little bit more on the steps that we need to follow in case we are dealing with a severely stressed orchid. And I think it's a great idea to watch those as well, because we're not going to focus on those things today, but actually talk about already rootless, already stressed orchids, when all measurements of prevention failed, and how to assist those orchids to recovery. Now, first of all, orchid shock or transplant shock is to some extent considered normal, or at least understandable. These orchids have traveled a lot to get to our area and to our homes, and in that process, maybe they have been treated very poorly. So they might already be in a sort of shocked state when we purchase them. And because they keep changing their environment, they cannot just adjust something and focus on their health and growth. Also, maybe they weren't treated correctly on transport, and in flower shops, maybe they were overwatered or underwatered, and already their root system might be compromised, even though you might not be aware of it. And even though you might sometimes have the impression there is something you did terribly wrong, it might just be the result of all of this stress and mistreatment that just starts to become very visible when the orchid is in your possession. First of all, if you repotted your new orchid but then discovered that the orchid has no more roots, it is a very good idea to unpot it and cut away all of those dead roots, even if it means cutting away all the root system. If they're not alive anymore, they will not help the orchid. Also, if the orchid has a flower spike, it is a great idea to cut it all the way down to the base, just to limit the chances of your orchid trying to produce new buds or new branches that will greatly consume energy from the mother plant. Even if the orchid will try to produce a baby plant, it will not have enough energy to bring it far enough for the baby plant to be removed, potted separately, and actually continue life on its own. And even though we do our best to avoid these instances, having our orchid just become rootless happens sometimes. And it's not necessarily because of something we did, but just the cumulative effect of all of these factors. So what do we do from this point on? One thing we might be tempted to do is place our orchid in water, because typically that's what we do with roses and tulips and other cut plants. We place them in water in the hopes that they will get hydrated. Orchids don't work like that. In order for them to get properly hydrated, they need roots. So placing them in water will actually not help them get hydrated. It will actually do more harm than good, because at this point, there are no roots to absorb any of this water. Furthermore, all of this water will just make the bottom stem or axis or rhizome of our orchid, depending on the variety, be super soggy and extra wet, which is not something we want to do with orchids, particularly the epiphytic orchids, which are the vast majority of orchids on the market. This excessive water on the stem will be a great breeding ground for fungal spores, pathogens, bacteria, everything we might have in the air without realizing, which can set camp right here on the axis or the rhizome of the orchid, multiply and have a great time because water is the perfect medium for them, and in the end start to affect our little stem here. And this is something I see a lot in the comment section of my videos, and not only. I had a discussion recently with one of my viewers in particular, and she showed me a stem which was almost completely black and dark, and when she tried to press a little bit on it, all the orchid fell apart. And she was actually keeping her orchid in water just like this. This is not a solution. It will not actually help our orchid get hydrated. And depending on the environment, it has the potential to do a lot of damage to our orchid. What we can do in order to keep our orchid somewhere is place it in an empty glass or vase or jar, because in this way we are not promoting any extra moisture on the stem. The orchid is in the air just like it's supposed to be, since it's an epiphytic orchid. Furthermore, in this way we can actually provide humidity, which will help the orchid, as I will explain, by not promoting excessive water on the stem, simply by using a little bit of sphagnum moss or a wet medium at the bottom of our cup or our jar, just like this, just to provide water evaporation near the stem or the place where roots need to sprout. Higher humidity and higher moisture around the orchid actually helps a dehydrated, stressed orchid, even though indirectly. Higher humidity will not tell the orchid to create roots. What it will do is create a favorable environment for roots. When new roots will naturally start to sprout, they will have a more humid environment to grow in. And in my experience, the higher the humidity around the root system, the stronger those root tips, and the less chance of them actually stop growing due to very low humidity in the air. The roots don't need to touch anything, they don't need to be wet in order to properly grow and develop. High humidity will help them greatly and will make sure that they will grow without stopping. Most orchids we can grow, which are epiphytic, have a defense mechanism whenever they get very, very dehydrated. They limit water loss through respiration by shutting down the stomatas, which are the tiny breathing mechanisms underneath the leaves. So an orchid which is rootless can remain like this for quite a few months, much longer than any other terrestrial plant, simply because it is conserving water. However, depending on the amount of stress of the orchid and how long this process actually takes, the leaves can become severely dehydrated. And one way we can help or assist the orchid is by increasing the general humidity around it. A very popular way of easily increasing humidity around plants is by using a plastic bag. So what I have here is a bamboo skewer. This will act as a holding mechanism for our little tent. I will place it in the jar and then place the plastic bag on top of my orchid. Additionally, I can poke a few air holes to increase a little bit the ventilation as well. But what this will do is create a sort of mini greenhouse on top of my orchid while still letting light reaching the leaves. However, this method will not work for everybody in all environments because our temperatures and humidity conditions are all very, very different. Sometimes this method actually will promote the appearance of molds and all sorts of fungus sprouting on the stem of our orchid, on the dried leaves, molds which are not healthy for the plant. So definitely this is one method of going about it, but you will definitely have to monitor the system and see if you're prone to molds. If you are though, what you can do is just make sure that your orchid is not sitting in a very drafty or super ventilated location. Try to make sure the temperatures are not extremely warm around the orchid because they will make the metabolism of your orchid work a little bit faster. It doesn't mean you need to keep your orchid in the fridge or in very cool conditions. I would aim for 20 to 24 degrees Celsius. You will have the equivalent in Fahrenheit on the screen, but just make sure to avoid extremes. And if you have a location in your home which can benefit from higher humidity, maybe you have a humidifier, then that will help a little bit the orchid. It will raise a little the humidity around it and buy it more time to create those roots. The third step you need to consider is the location where you will place your orchid. We've already talked about the ideal humidity conditions and temperature conditions, but now let's talk about the possibility of your orchid just being bumped over or falling from wherever it is, or just being moved around a lot. When dealing with a very stressed and dehydrated orchid, it is a very good idea to not move it around too much, because by moving it around a lot, you will make it adapt to whatever the new conditions are. It's pretty much like what it experienced on transport or in the flower shop and then to your home. It's just this sudden change of environment, which in this stage is really not a good idea. So do try to avoid switching the location of your orchid way too often. Try to find a perfect location from the beginning and keep your orchid there. Don't change the light source way too much. Don't change the position of the light way too much as possible. If you need to take it and look at it and then put it back, that's perfectly fine, but try to maintain a very similar position. Do not rotate the orchid, because all of these movements will stress it, and further stress is not what we need right now. Related to stressing the orchid by moving it around, don't start to treat your orchid with all sorts of potions. You might start to see just a little bit of mold forming. Don't start to spray hydrogen peroxide or fungicides or all sorts of substances on your orchid just yet. If your orchid has a few dried leaf remains, it is absolutely normal for them to accumulate a little bit of mold. It doesn't mean the orchid is in danger, because we don't have excessive water in our setup. So accumulation of excessive pathogens is still limited, but there are a few molds that just feed on dried plant material, and that is okay. One thing you can do is try to remove all of these dried bits on your orchid, but if you see you cannot do so and you might actually damage the stem, let them be. It's okay. They don't actually pose a danger, and really for just a little bit of mold on those dried sheets, don't start spraying all sorts of substances, because these substances do actually contain water as well. So even after the initial reaction happens, the water that's left behind is still a good place for pathogens to settle in, and you risk rotting the stem of your orchid, which is not something you want to do. As long as the mold is not excessive, it's not a problem, and the more you can eliminate those dried sheets, the better the situation will get. Step number 5, as much as possible, use soft water such as distilled water, reverse osmosis water, and also avoid fertilizer at all cost. Since your orchid does not have roots, it is pointless to try and offer it fertilizer because it cannot pick it up, so it will not help it. Furthermore, the salts from your fertilizer will just accumulate. If they accumulate on the stem, they can damage the stem and create open doors for pathogens to settle in. The same thing will happen with hard water as well. And especially for a very sensitive, stressed orchid, it is a much better idea to find soft water. If you can collect rain, that's perfect. Melted snow is very soft as well, or you can just go to the store and find some distilled water. Or, of course, if you have a reverse osmosis system in your home which delivers soft water, that is absolutely perfect for these types of orchids. This step is particularly useful when your orchid is actually starting to create those roots, and you will place it on top of the medium. But before that step, there is another very crucial thing we need to do. Step number 6, wait. Just be patient and wait it out. This is such an important step to do because orchids are not like many other plants we might grow. They are slow-growing plants, particularly epiphytic orchids, and it can typically take a month or two before you start seeing new roots being produced. Furthermore, depending on the orchid, you might have to wait more than that, such as in the case of Cattleya orchids, which, by the way, we do have a tutorial for. Check it down below in the description. Some Cattleyas have very specific growth patterns and they only grow in specific seasons. So if your orchid is rootless in the middle of summer, but new growth and new roots typically should start in the winter or spring, then chances are your orchid will not start to create new roots until winter or spring. Case in which it is important to try and follow the other steps in which we are assisting the orchid until new roots naturally sprout. I know that waiting for a month or 2 or even 3 is a little bit counterintuitive, and the more we wait, the more we are alarmed and worried. But as I was saying, these types of orchids are very well adapted to drought. And in my example, you can see that my Cattleya has very shriveled pseudobulbs, and even the leaves are shriveled. It has waited for the past 4 months or 3 months or so to create a new growth with new roots. And still, after 3 or 4 months, I still have a live orchid, be it a little bit dehydrated. Can you say the same thing about a tomato plant if by chance it remained rootless? No. These orchids are indeed very resilient, and most often than not, they will pull through with just a little bit of assistance. Step number 7. The roots are finally starting to grow. You can see the little nubbins starting to sprout. What do we do from here? Well, if you kept your orchid on top of wet sphagnum moss or in a different container, you can actually move your orchid right now to a new pot and its somewhat forever medium. It is a good idea to do this process right now before the roots get any longer, because the longer they are, the more chances you have of actually damaging them when you're moving the orchid around a little bit too much. So when you see the first little nubbin starting to grow, this is when you should pot your orchid or put it in the medium you'd like it to sit. If you're afraid you will damage the root tips with media such as bark or leca or other inorganic or actually abrasive materials, use sphagnum moss. Sphagnum is a very soft material, and even if you move the orchid a little bit, it will not damage the root tips. It is just like a nice fluffy pillow for the roots. So if you want, at least at the beginning, place a layer of moss on top of your medium, just to make sure that the roots do not get damaged while they're very tiny and cannot branch. But generally, it is now that you need to move your orchid to its pot or basket or wherever you want to keep it. Once you potted your orchid, make sure that it is very well stabilized. You can use stakes, you can pin the existing canes or pseudobulbs if you have such things. If not, just make sure that you pot your orchid in such manner that you don't actually risk the orchid falling from its pot. You can use decorative pots and just lean the leaves of the Phalaenopsis on top of the decorative pots. Whatever you do, try to make sure that the orchid will not excessively jiggle around and damage its beautiful fresh new roots. Also, at this time, it is very important to continue with that distilled water or very soft water. Again, we don't want the root tips to be damaged by anything. And since they are very tiny, they cannot absorb nutrients just yet, and they are particularly susceptible to salt accumulations on the medium. So hard water and fertilizer is not needed at this stage. All you need is soft water, and try to maintain that medium always a little bit damp but airy. Step number 9, adjusting the roots to your watering regime, the environment, and the medium. You will notice at some point as the roots grow that they will start to turn green, or you will see them just getting wet. It is at this time that the roots are actually starting to absorb water. In the beginning, when roots are very tiny, they don't actually absorb water, but the root tip is particularly susceptible to very dry conditions. Well, when the roots start to absorb water, it is when we can start to train, if you will, how they are going to adapt. At this point, we can start to let the medium slightly dry out in between waterings and not keep it all that soggy all the time. In this way, the roots will get adjusted to this style of watering, which is a very appropriate style for epiphytic orchids, and most orchids we can grow in our homes with the exception of a few. And of course, because they are absorbing water, they have already started to hydrate the orchid. So the orchid is not losing excessive water anymore, but it's getting hydrated. So it is important not to let the orchid be super dry and in drought conditions yet again for way too long, but when you see that the roots start to become a little bit dry, that's when you need to water. At this point, we're also trying to avoid root rot, and letting the roots dry in between waterings makes sure that the medium replenishes its air pockets, which orchids absolutely need because they need air as well. And another piece of good news, you are on the right track to having a fully recovered orchid very, very soon. All the hard part was before the roots started to absorb water. From here on, things will get very, very easy. Depending on the orchid, in a month or so, you will see the roots starting to take over the pot. The roots are already absorbing water, the orchid is not so dehydrated anymore. It is time to start fertilizing and feed our orchid, because now it can actually utilize those nutrients. So first off, just to be on the safe side, start with half the recommended dosage that you can find on the label of your fertilizer. There is no need to use a full dosage because at this point your orchid is still not functioning at 100% capacity. It is just forming a brand new root system. The new growth might be much smaller than the previous growths. The orchid probably will not bloom this season or maybe this year, so it doesn't need a full dosage of fertilizer. Start with half, don't fertilize it very often. If the label on your fertilizer says fertilize every week, then fertilize it with half the amount every 2 weeks or even every 3 weeks. And as the orchid just starts to grow and becomes bushier and bushier, you can actually increase the dosage until one day when your orchid is fully recovered and completely not dehydrated anymore. It is growing fast, it has new growths bigger than the previous ones, and at this point you can fertilize with the full amount of fertilizer that you typically use with other orchids or that is recommended by the manufacturer. It is at this point that your orchid is completely recovered and it only took you 10 steps to get here. However, though, there are a few more things you need to know. Orchids which have recently been through stress might not bloom. They might skip a season or a year depending on the type of orchid you have, and that is perfectly fine. Just because your orchid doesn't bloom but otherwise looks very, very healthy doesn't mean there's something wrong with it. It just means it needs a little bit more time to gather its strength to actually put on a great bloom show. At the same time, your orchid might bloom, but the bloom show might not be all that fabulous. It might create only 2 or 3 flowers, and under normal conditions, it could create 10 flowers. Also, the previous leaves or canes or pseudobulbs, they might actually not return to their normal self. In this example, you can see I have a Cattleya with severe discoloration on the very old growth, but the newest growth, it all looks fine. This is something that will never be remedied. This is because this orchid was very, very dehydrated at some point. Different orchids will react in different ways, and that stressful period can actually leave marks on your orchid, from leaf marks to pseudobulbs, which are never going to be super plump again, smaller canes or pseudobulbs, or smaller leaves in the case of Phalaenopsis orchids. That is okay. That is just a sort of battle wound, but it doesn't mean the orchid will be affected by it, and as it grows, that old part of the orchid will not even be visible anymore. So these have been the 10 tips that help orchid recover from shock, whether it's transplant shock or simply the shock of getting adjusted to a new environment, which is very, very real, and it can happen with any orchid. I hope this video will help you out. Don't forget to check the description for additional information on avoiding transplant shock as much as possible, on rehydrating Phalaenopsis in particular, and other useful information that I find. And before I let you go, I wanted to thank Repotme yet again for sponsoring this video and the additional videos that they propose to sponsor during this time just to help me out. I'm very, very grateful for that, and it reinforces my decision to actually accept this collaboration with them for the past almost 2 years at this point. So with that said, thank you again for watching this video. I hope you're all well, and you know the drill. Like or dislike this video below, subscribe to my channel for regular orchid videos, tutorials, experiments, and other fun orchid subjects. Feel free to visit my Instagram and Facebook for even more content, and with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Bye!